On Sunday, Argentinian President Javier Milei presented the country's annual budget. True to form, Milei turned an event that's usually a relatively muted affair, with the new budget presented by the finance minister to Congress, into a national spectacle. Broadcast on national television in an attempt to rally support for his austere reforms, Milei himself presented the budget with his back turned to Congress, announcing his intention to shackle the state and attacking opposition lawmakers as, quote, miserable rats who bet against this country. As you'd expect, the budget was ambitious, promising further cuts to public services and a primary surplus of 1.3% of GDP in a country that's already run massive deficits for most of recent history. But perhaps most interestingly, the budget forecasts GDP growth of 5% next year and an annual inflation rate of just 18%. Which both feel optimistic given that Argentina is still marred with recession and inflation that has apparently stabilized at an annual rate of well over 100%. So in this video, we're going to take another look at the Argentinian economy, why things don't look all that great for Milei at the moment, and whether his new budget can fix it. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and ringing the bell to stay in the loop and be notified when we release new videos. So, before we get into the specifics of the budget, it's worth providing a little context. As we've described in previous videos, Milei's immediate objective is stabilizing the Argentinian economy, which has had a turbulent time for the past, few decades or so. In effect, this involves balancing Argentina's twin deficits. In other words, cutting the fiscal deficit, i.e. reducing government borrowing, and cutting the current account deficit, i.e. making sure that Argentina doesn't import more than it exports. The main mechanism for balancing the current account is a devaluation of the peso, which has been devalued by over 70% by Milei as part of wider attempts to unify and simplify Argentina's currency regime. Anyway, by reducing these two deficits, Milei would at least temporarily reduce GDP. Balancing the fiscal deficit will mean a reduction in government spending, while balancing the current account deficit will mean a reduction in domestic consumption thanks to fewer imports. Nonetheless, Milei has always been optimistic that the Argentinian economy would enjoy a, quote, V-shaped recovery, driven by investments and exports. Now, so far, Milei has made good on his promise of balancing the fiscal deficit. Thanks to various cuts, government spending has fallen by over 10%, allowing Argentina to run its first quarterly surplus since 2008 earlier this year. And Sunday's budget promises to continue in this vein. Not only does it promise further and continued cuts to public services, but Milei also asked for further cuts from provincial governments, which have often stepped in to fill the gaps left by Milei's recent austerity. Interestingly, while health and education budgets are facing steep cuts, other departments have been spared, including, most notably, the army. In fact, Milei has promised to quadruple Argentina's military spending over the next 8 years, from 0.5% of GDP to 2%. It's not really clear why Milei wants to do this. Milei has previously suggested using the army against drug gangs inside Argentina, but this isn't a popular idea in a country that was run by military dictatorship not all that long ago. And Argentina is hardly likely to go to war anytime soon. It is possible that this is Milei's way of buddying up to the Americans. Argentina recently asked to become a global partner of NATO, and Milei clearly wants Argentina to side with America over China. But this seems like an expensive and roundabout way of actually doing this. Anyway, as we mentioned in the intro, perhaps the most interesting part of the budget is its optimistic forecasts for GDP growth and inflation. We say optimistic not just because they're significantly better than what Argentina is currently experiencing, but also because there just aren't really any signs that things are even on their way up at the moment. Again, as we mentioned a second ago, Milei is hoping for an export and investment-driven recovery, facilitated by a unified and devalued peso. A unified currency would make it easier to invest in Argentina, while a cheaper peso would make Argentinian exports more competitive internationally. Milei has also introduced a series of controversial policies designed to encourage new foreign investment into Argentina, including, perhaps most notably, a large investment incentive regime approved by the Senate on June 12th. This scheme, known by its acronym RIGI, basically provides super generous 30-year tax incentives for big multinational companies investing more than $200 million in Argentina's export-led industries, including agriculture and shale, with the promise that they can keep 100% of the profits of any exports. This regime even exempts corporations from certain environmental regulations, and includes provisions allowing them to sue the Argentinian state if it gets in their way. Anyway, while there have been some good data points, slight upticks in exports or investments in certain areas of the economy have been insufficient to offset the wider downturn. In the first quarter, Argentina's GDP contracted by 5.1% year-on-year. And while we don't yet have data for Q2, Argentina's economic activity estimator, a sort of monthly proxy for GDP, came in at negative 3.9% in June, driven by declines in construction and manufacturing. This is way down from the 1.4% increase we saw in May when we did our last video on Argentina. And while you might expect weak economic activity to mean lower inflation, this hasn't happened. While Argentina's month-on-month inflation rate has fallen from its dizzying highs when Milei first devalued the peso, for the past few months it's sat stubbornly around 4%. Worryingly for Milei, in August, inflation actually ticked up from 4% to 4.2%. And it's worth stressing that this is monthly inflation, and a 4% monthly inflation rate translates to about 160% inflation annually. Anxieties about persistent inflation explain why Milei recently reduced Argentina's import tax, and might also explain why he introduced a new tax amnesty for dollar deposits, which has convinced Argentinians to deposit hundreds of millions of previously undisclosed dollar savings into Argentinian banks. This could be because Milei wants to dollarize the economy as soon as possible, in the hope that switching to the dollar will reduce inflation by providing Argentinians with a stable currency, unlike the consistently devaluing peso. Anyway, in this context, any austerity is obviously risky because it could further dampen growth. But what makes Milei's budget so high stakes is the fact that it includes clauses which would adjust revenues and expenditures to meet his zero deficit pledge if GDP and therefore tax revenues come in under forecast. In other words, if the Argentinian economy stays in recession, Milei's proposed budget would actually cut spending even further, potentially triggering a dangerous feedback loop where weak growth means more austerity, which means more weak growth. For his part, Milei would dismiss this as Keynesian nonsense and insist that Argentina simply has to learn to live within its means. But it's hard to imagine the Argentinian public tolerating even steeper cuts in the depths of a recession. So Milei sort of needs the economy to improve to get away with it. Fans of TLDR, like you, care about understanding the world around them. And that's where today's sponsor, Imprint, comes into play. Because if you care about building a life of learning, then Imprint is the app for you. It's a brand new way to learn, built from the ground up. And seriously, unless you've used the app before, you likely haven't experienced anything like this. That's because Imprint is beautifully illustrated and animated, creating a highly visual, bite-sized, and interactive learning experience. It's the perfect antidote to a world where social media tries to keep us mindlessly dopamine scrolling day in, day out. Their library includes courses on topics like psychology, history, philosophy, finance, productivity, and many more, as well as quick reads you can consume in a single sitting. In fact, I've been using the Essential Philosophy, Theories and Thinkers course, and it's been an excellent way to brush up on some knowledge from college that I genuinely thought was lost. And with all of the developments happening these days, from elections to AI to geopolitical tensions, it's been helpful to revisit some of the world's greatest thinkers. So make yourself feel better about your screen time, build a real habit of learning every day, and join the millions of people using Imprint. If you use the link in the description, the first 200 people will get 20% off an annual plan. Plus, they'll know you came from us.